We're recording. I am here with Tyler McNabb. Tyler, welcome to the channel, and I'll have a proper bio on you in the description. But would you like to take a moment to sort of introduce yourself as you see fit?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at St. Francis University in Pennsylvania. However, I'm actually transitioning. I'm moving to a university in Vietnam, so Vinh University in Hanoi. But primarily publish in religious epistemology and comparative philosophy and some political philosophy. So kind of have made my mark defending Plantinga's views on epistemology and so forth, and then as of the last handful of years, really been concentrating on Eastern philosophy and how uh, you can logically make consistent with classical theism, and that there might actually, in fact, be genuine convergence between the two views. And so, anyway, that's primarily what I do, and been married for I guess 17 years in January, and our seventh kid is on the way. So, very stereotypical big Catholic family.
Yeah, yeah. All right, great. Yeah, and so like you've done a lot of really interesting work, and there's so much that I could talk to you about, and maybe we will have a chance for future conversations. The reason that I wanted to talk to you today is to run some objections to Christianity generally, Catholicism in particular, past you, and just sort of see what you have to say. I know that you have a lot of interesting thoughts to share about some questions that have eaten at me for a long time, and one in particular that really caused me to reach out that I think is under discussed, and that's an objection relating to Christianity's history of anti-Semitism. So that's yeah, I want that to sort of be the focus. That's what we're
Yeah,
sort of building up to. Um, Before we get to that and develop that objection and hash it out, um, I wanted to just go through some other preliminary objections to kind of warm you up.
sure, sure.
Okay, so I sent Tyler an outline here. I'm going to maybe let's see, yeah, change the order a little bit. Maybe we can start with an objection relating to seemingly ahistorical elements of the Old Testament
Hmm.
slash Hebrew Bible, depending on
Yeah,
one's
yeah, yeah.
perspective, right? So to sort of set this up for you, um, seems like on a face value reading of Genesis 1 through 11 and other elements of the Old Testament, what's there in Scripture doesn't align with what rational investigation, rational inquiry reveals to us about the natural history of the world,
Sure.
and human history,
Yeah.
right? And the reason this can serve as a difficult objection, I think, to Christianity is that if we think that Christianity gets some really important elements of history wrong, that seems to maybe undercut the authority of the text, the tradition
Right.
more broadly, and so on. And so it seems like we need to have something to say in response to that challenge. Okay, so initial thoughts or
Right.
reactions to that kind of challenge.
Yeah, so just to make the viewers clear on what perspective I'm coming from, I'm a card-carrying neo-Darwinian
Yeah.
who firmly believes the universe is roughly 13.7 billion years old, that sort of thing. How do I approach scripture? Well, yeah, so Saint Augustine, leave Clement of Alexandria, some others as well. Um, when they looked at Genesis, the beginning of Genesis, especially Genesis 1 through 11, they didn't read it in a very literalistic fashion and say, all right, well, this must mean that these were 24-hour days and the universe indeed is 6,000 plus years old. That wasn't their approach. And so it's not like when I'm about to kind of argue for, it's not something just kind of ad hoc, something much later, 20th century response to Darwin approach to interpreting scripture, but something that's deep seated within the church's tradition. To understand Genesis is not giving a very historical, literal account. And so, in fact, most scholars today, as I understand it, view Genesis 1 through 11, especially, as mythohistory. And so that's to say that it's a particular genre for the ancient Near East. And basically, the idea is that there are kernels of truth and kernels, maybe even of historical truth, that are kind of embedded in a mythological structure and a mythological narrative. So, talking snakes and life-giving trees and all this sort of thing. Like this is all using a mythological genre, but to express certain truths that are, uh, you know, apt or reflect reality and that sort of thing. And so, if that's your primary interpretation of Genesis, well, then that's obviously going to stave off some concerns there. As for kind of neo-Darwinianism, you might sometimes you might hear something like, well, hey, neo-Darwinianism endorses that, say there are random mutations, right? Then God can't guide them, and so then you have conflict, right? But generally, if you read what biologists talk about, what they mean by random, they mean that there's no physical mechanism within an organism that's dictating the next mutations. And in that sense, if you think God's not a physical mechanism, God can guide the mutations, and you still have random mutations and so on and so forth. I think Genesis 1 and 2 is primarily actually about the creation of Eden. So there's a biblical scholar named John Sailhamer, and he's got a really nice little book, I think called Genesis Unbound. And in it, he looks at the particular like rocks and rivers and all these sorts of things that are expressed within Genesis 1 and 2, and then later these same things are used for describing the tabernacle or the temple. The idea is that this is all about the Eden, all about paradise, and the creation of Eden, not so much the creation of the cosmos. And so, I guess it's kind of a version of gap theory where you have God creates the cosmos, and then you have the next verse talking about particularly God's creation of Eden. And so he's a Southern Baptist, for example. He thinks that this is consistent with the universe being 13.7 billion years old. So anyway, there's lots of ways to approach this, but I guess these are generally my approaches to understanding Genesis.
I mean, I really appreciate that. I appreciate that perspective. I will say that I'm not somebody who will just heap massive amounts of scorn on young Earth creationist types. I mean, I understand the kind of motives that drive people in that
Mm,
direction. I think they're understandable. I mean, they're trying to respect the text. They're trying to respect the tradition.
right.
It's not viable for me because, I think for a lot of us, it requires, by my lights, just adopting a perspective that cuts way too hard against what reason reveals to
Right.
us. Yeah, so I mean, I'm sympathetic to the way that you want to think about these things. I think
Yeah.
the thing that worries me, that still sort of continues to eat at me a little bit, is that it seems like most, and you can correct me if my perception of this is wrong, but it seems
Yeah.
like probably most of the believers in history did take this to be like actual history. They thought that there was a global flood, that Noah really existed, and took two of every kind on the ark and so on, right? And so it seems like maybe there's some kind of worry about like the tradition itself being
Mhm.
deceptive or something. If most believers in the past
Mm.
understood these stories to be very different from what they actually turn out to be. So yeah, just a reaction to that.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So obviously there, especially the like Alexandrian school and so forth. I do think there's definitely a living Christian presence throughout the ages that have not been so kind of historical in their understanding of especially the Old Testament more generally. Um,
Hmm.
so you have people like um, Gregory of Nyssa, or even when it comes to like passages like regarding the Passover in the Old Testament, um, not thinking that the text was actually given to Israel by God to declare that God really was going to kill the firstborn of um, everyone who doesn't put blood on the doorpost, right? If you can recall the Passover story. And so nonetheless, they took the text in a spiritual way, and their literal interpretation of the text was basically an allegorical interpretation. And so they would say, oh no, this is here, right? Like the Canaanite passages are here because the Canaanite represents sin and Israel represents us, the church, and we're supposed to wipe out all the sin. And if we leave even a little bit of sin in our hearts, just residing and unchallenged, it'll eventually grow and develop and conquer us. And so, the idea is that we were supposed to interpret the text in light of Christ, in light of the gospel, the New Testament. And when we do that, we're not going to be like some of old who were like, hey, the Old Testament's a different God, right? It's completely foreign from the God of the New Testament. Instead, it's like, no, 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 no. Like these are texts, these are inspired by God. These are given to us by God for our own understanding and our own um, uh, sanctification. But we're supposed to take the literal interpretation, so to speak. It's supposed to be a allegorical interpretation, and so um, you have like the life of Moses, for example. This makes it really clear in regard to Exodus and God not actually like going and directly killing the firstborn of all the Egyptians and Jews who didn't put the blood on their doorposts and so forth. And it's not just this. It's not just the Canaanite passages. It's not just the psalm that says smash the baby head against the rock and that sort of thing. I mean, yeah, yeah. I mean, you might be right. This might not be the majority view, but it's definitely a view that's well represented and present throughout the history of Christendom. And so I don't take it to be the kind of unanimous witness of the church, so to speak. And so I think a lot of this, evolves as we continue to evolve and think about the texts. And as a Catholic, I think doctrine develops, and so you know, Newman talks about it kind of being like a seed that develops ultimately into a tree. And so, do you think that the early church, let's say the church at 110 AD, would they recognize the church today? Maybe not, but it's
Hmm.
okay because maybe you wouldn't recognize a little bitty tree or a seed as a massive tree today. You might say that what's important that has certain commonalities that say consistent, certain kind of it doesn't contradict itself in some way going in the past, but it's going to grow, it's going to develop, and yeah, it might look very kind of unrecognizable. And so the church, as it develops and furthers its understanding about genres and texts and so forth, it's pretty now widely consented to that these texts aren't supposed to be taken in a literal historical way.
I think it's really important to, as you do there, emphasize the historical groundedness of this kind of non-literalistic mytho-historical understanding of many of these texts. So this is not just something that like liberal theologians in the 20th
Exactly.
century developed. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. So I think that much of what you said there is going to inform your response to
Yeah.
the next challenge. And you already have sort of addressed it indirectly, but yeah, I mean the other challenge that's kind of related to this is not historically implausible, but morally implausible
Mm.
elements of the Old Testament, right? So, examples that seeming acceptance of slavery, uh, concubinage, mass animal
Right.
sacrifice, the story of Jephthah's daughter, the
Yeah.
the commanded genocide, or what seems to
Yeah.
at
Right.
least strongly resemble the genocide of the Amalekites, Canaanites, and so forth, right? So there's a lot there that seems like one can encounter these texts and feel like, well, doesn't seem like this is the sort of stuff that I would find in the true religion. It doesn't seem like
Right.
these sorts of commands, like relating to the Amalekites, reflect the nature of a perfect being, and so they
Right.
could then inspire one, to, even if one already thinks God, a perfect being exists, just to think that,
Hmm.
okay, like, this doesn't really describe how to be in relation to that being, these sets of texts. Okay, so yeah, how do you deal with apparent moral
Yeah.
atrocities in the Old Testament?
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. I mean, even when we look at something like Noah's Ark, right? I mean, it's something, yeah, as a fellow Texan, right? You grow up maybe hearing about this, the story of Noah's Ark, and maybe you even have like um, blankets or toys or replicas of Noah's Ark. But like when you actually think about the story, right? It's like God's literally wiping out everyone besides Noah and his
Yeah, it
boys.
doesn't seem very nice. Yeah.
Everyone's gonna like drown and die, including like little children and such. And so, yeah, you might think, well, that seems pretty problematic, right? But again, like what is being told here? What are the essential truths that are being told? Um, and the idea is that God creates humans. What do humans do? Like immediately they sin,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in fact, they end up right. Um, uh, Cain and Abel, right? They end up killing each other really, really quickly. And so there's this, it's almost like a theodicy of sorts. It's like if God just tries to wipe out evil, he's just going to kill us all. And then the few that remain are just going to end up doing evil because, right, when Noah lands, right, his son sees his nakedness, which is like up for debate about how you want to interpret that. Um, and but some moral issue occurs, some evil occurs, right? He gets drunk, and then his son sees his nakedness, whatever that means. And it's just like sin is still there, it's still present, and it's just like God can't take he can't treat sin that way. Like God's not going to be able to just wipe out the bad guys because even in the hearts of the good guys, they're still bad and it's still going to manifest and that's still going to be an issue. And so God's going to have to direct this in a wholly different way. So passages like the laws. I mean, there is an approach that I've got like evangelical friends who will basically they'll interpret the Old Testament law like, stoning someone who's caught in adultery or stoning someone who, blasphemes or whatever. Um, they'll interpret this as basically God kind of saying like, look at all the other far, the ancient Near East sort of laws and texts that are given, and they're all really really hard, really really mean. What God's doing is He's taking kind of a more of like an ancient barbaric people and time frame, and He's kind of meeting them halfway, and He's like, all right, guys, I'll allow you to be somewhat barbaric, but they're going to have some constraints in which eventually ultimately the hope is to have like no barbarism and so on and so forth. I mean that's one interpretation. That's not my preferred interpretation, but that is one interpretation. How I would understand it is maybe God gave some of the laws, maybe He didn't give some of the laws that it says that God gave them. But at the same time, all scriptures God breathed, and all scriptures for building up doctrine and that sort of thing. And so, even if God didn't actually command the Israelites to wipe out the Canaanites and so forth, we can still have that passage, and through the light of Christ, again, kind of interpret this passage for our salvation, for our own benefit. through understanding that the church is Israel and the Canaanites are the sin, and kind of what I mentioned earlier about how we need to wipe out all the sins that will overtake us. I mean, you can do this with other passages as well. It's not just the Canaanite passages where basically the idea is you think God, in some sense, adopted, wrote, um, authored these texts, but these texts from God's standpoint were not meant to be taken literally, but only in this kind of allegorical fashion. And so that's kind of my approach to a lot of the Old Testament laws and commands and sayings and so forth. And again, there's precedent for this. I mean, if you look at the life of Moses, or you look at some of these other texts, especially within the Eastern Church, from the Eastern Church fathers and stuff, you'll see this type of reasoning.
Yeah, great. So just to draw that out a little bit, it's sufficient, you think, to understand these texts to be teaching important theological and moral truths to, right? That's all you really have to think to be a serious small Orthodox Catholic. You don't have to think that necessarily all this stuff literally happened. You just have to think that it's there for a reason. It's supposed to teach us something, but what that is, maybe it's kind of mysterious. Maybe we haven't fully figured it out.
Yeah, yeah, and there's been a lot. I mean, if you were to look at a lot of some of the fathers and some of these hard passages, uh, these kind of moral passages that we're talking about here, morally problematic passages. Yeah, there's actually a lot of explanations that are given, and it's kind of like a wide field. One book I recommend is from Matthew Ramage. He's got a book on kind of the dark passages of the Bible. I think that's what the title of the book is, and he actually looks at Pope Benedict, or as he was more commonly referred to as a theologian, as Ratzinger, and kind of his interpretation of these old passages. And the sort of approach that I'm espousing now actually is fits quite well with kind of the hermeneutic found in his work. So
I'll link to that
yeah,
in case
uh,
people are interested. Yeah. Okay. Great. All super helpful. So, all right. I feel like to set you up for the next bit, maybe I should just tee you up to let you give a quick rundown on two ideas that I think are going to be important in dealing with the main challenge for today relating to anti-Semitism.
yeah.
Those are Reformed epistemology, which I know you've thought a thing or two about, and skeptical theism.
Mm.
Do you want to just give a quick rundown on both of those ideas, since I know you'll be appealing to them?
Yeah, so Reformed epistemology is just the thesis that religious belief can be properly basic, or another way to put it, it can be justified or warranted apart from argument. Michael Bergman, in a Cambridge handbook that I edit with John Greco and Jonathan Fuqua, he basically says the kind of the central component of Reformed epistemology is kind of this idea of anti-inferentialism. And so, the idea is that we don't have to make inferences to have rational or justified or warranted belief of positive epistemic status about our belief about God, or whatnot. We can have knowledge of God or have some positive epistemic status without getting into arguments, without having access to arguments, without making inferences, that sort of thing. And so, Plantinga's main way to go about this is to say, hey, look at belief in other minds. A lot of philosophers think that there really aren't good arguments for belief in other minds, right? For showing that other minds exist, right? I mean, we can all think about skeptical scenarios like Descartes and his evil demon, or we could think about simulation hypotheses, or we can think about Boltzmann brain hypotheses, right? And we can try to kind of always become very skeptical about if other minds truly exist, and whether or not our explanations for this phenomena is actually true, corresponds with reality. Because if you think about it, like evil demon hypotheses or Boltzmann brain hypotheses, in some sense, are actually even simpler than the real world hypothesis, so to speak. And so it was like, come on, belief in other minds clearly is rational, it's justified, warranted, whatever. It's basically just it's part of our cognitive structure, and so you can actually trace uh, the cognitive development of belief in other minds very early on. So, for example, young infants prefer normal faces over disfigured faces, and you can kind of trace that and see its development, over time until around 2 to 3. Kind of a really robust understanding of other people existing is there in the toddler. Maybe God's like kind of in a similar way. Maybe we're naturally inclined to produce belief about God. And so, in fact, this is what cognitive science of religion, the paradigm view, seems to support: is that belief in God's an evolutionary spandrel. That we naturally uh, believe in divinity and the supernatural. One main theory that's postulated to make sense of this is the idea that maybe we have this hypersensitive agency detection device
Right.
where we detect agency even when it's not there, um, uh, though largely it's reliable. This idea of a theory of mind that's kind of been built in us, as I mentioned earlier with other minds, and then just this idea that we see teleology, uh, a lot. And so we're promiscuous at teleology sometimes, and so you put these kind of things together, you see some beautiful natural phenomena, and then we see why people naturally believe there's like agents behind it or something like that, right? And so planning is like, well, hey, but if these cognitive modules are properly functioning and aimed at truth, then we could actually, have knowledge about God and His design and the world apart from argument. In the same way, we just kind of believe that other people exist. And he has a similar approach to, how do we know the universe wasn't created 5 seconds ago with the appearance of age, or the future will be like the past, problem of humans, problem of induction, that sort of thing. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of Plantinga's approach is to say that uh, we're naturally kind of intuitive theists, so to speak. Now, there might be some people who are not. There might be some people who, and there might be even scientific explanations for this. Kelly James Clark has his own interpretation of this. Um, you might think it has to do with original sin and so forth, as Plantinga is more inclined to think. But he even thought that Christian belief can be warranted apart from argument, and um, that was largely through testimony and the instigation and movement of the Spirit, testifying to us and moving us to believe in the testimony of the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus for forgiveness of sin. So yeah, I mean that's roughly Reformed epistemology. It's while Plantinga uses proper functionalism, it's consistent, as I've argued elsewhere. It's consistent with lots of main theories in epistemology. So phenomenal conservatism, even an internalist theory. Of course, it's consistent with process reliabilism and other versions of reliabilism as well. So I've got a friend, Kagan Shaw, who argues that it's you can be an epistemic disjunctivist, and be a reformed epistemologist. So anyway, that hopefully that's enough to make sense of that. And then skeptical theism. Here's a view basically that says like you have a problem of evil, and the problem of evil debate. You have uh, with a logical problem of evil, which basically just says like there's a genuine contradiction that we can derive from the existence of God and evil together. Like these things can't be, right? If God's all powerful, he'd want to stop the evil. All good, he'd want to stop it. And all knowledge, all knowing, he'd know where all the evil was to stop it. He doesn't stop it, therefore he must not exist, right? A lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people pretty much think that's kind of that has good answers to, good responses to, and God might permit evil for a greater good in some way, and a similar way in which someone gets maybe a shot that's really painful, but nonetheless brings about a greater good in building up the immunity of the individual to prevent them from dying from some horrible disease. Which, by the way, people should get vaccinated. Anyway, and Yeah. And so some people will go, okay, but aren't there like certain instances of evil that seem just kind of gratuitous, purposeless? Um, and this seems problematic. And so William Moreau gives the example of little Bambi who's like frolicking through the forest and catches on fire and dies this slow and agonizing death. And the idea is like, well, I can't see any greater good that would come from this, so probably there isn't any. And the skeptical theist goes, hold on, wait a minute. Just because you can't see that there's a greater good, or just because you can't imagine what sort of goods that exist that the could possibly be had from this Bambi suffering in the way that it does, doesn't mean that there aren't any goods. And so basically, skeptical theism is this idea that we're not in a position to judge what sort of goods exist uh, from permitting certain kinds of evils. So really, kind of the version of skeptical theism that I like the most would even say something stronger. Would say we're not in the position to judge um, what um, God would likely do in some instance of evil. And so, on my view, I have a very apophatic view of God. So I don't think that God is a thing. So you might say, well, like we need a grounding for all things. Well, if it's a grounding of all things, we can't then include God as a thing if he's going to be the grounding of all things. So, God, we need something that's not a thing to ground all things. God's not a thing, at least as the classical tradition has put it, or one of the classical traditions have put it. Um, Even as the Neoplatonic tradition puts it, like God is no hyphen thing, no thing, right? Nothing. Um, I believe in divine simplicity. He's not made up of properties or parts. He's identical to existence itself. But even understanding, our existence is different than God's existence. We're kind of this realm of existent things, and God's beyond all that. And so, if you kind of have this view of God that's really apophatic, ineffable and that sort of thing, then it seems, on my view, God's not even a moral agent. At most, we can say he's a moral agent star. He's not a person. At most, we can say he's a person star, right? He's the ground of all being instead. And so while I'm okay to say that God is analogically a person, maybe even analogically a moral agent, he's not this kind of very anthropomorphic version of you and me, but just kind of with omni properties. And so, yeah, I'm very skeptical. Bible says that God's thoughts are not our thoughts, His ways are not our ways, in the book of Isaiah. And so, I'm very doubtful that we're sort of like in a position to judge what this ineffable being would do in a case of instance of evil. Now, maybe you can say, well, he reveals to us who he is in the New Testament, and that can inform the likelihood of what he'd likely do. But even that, if that's largely analogies, I think that there's some degree in which we can kind of rule out certain scenarios based off of like, hey, there has to be some semblance somewhere. But generally, I'm much more skeptical about doing so. So the Catholic Church, in one of its councils, says that the analogies we give for God are actually more dissimilar than similar in reference to the overall similarity. And so, if you have this sort of approach, I think this idea of hey, there's an instance of evil, it looks gratuitous to us, therefore it probably is just ultimately going to be undercut and not justified. And so that's the kind of view that I hold regarding God and evil.
So just super quick follow-ups. Um, so one, reformed epistemology was, originally developed by Plantinga, who's not Catholic.
Right,
You're a bit,
right.
but it is consistent. I know you've done work on this, but you think it's entirely consistent with Catholicism, though.
Yeah, right. So actually, I mean, if you even look at Aquinas and his questions, he will, he'll argue and he'll say, no, we're obligated to believe in the gospel and in Christ, even if there were no miracles, because of the inward, movement of the Spirit. And then the second reason he gives is because of teachers and the authority of the church. And so yeah, I think this is in Aquinas. I think this is in many other early church fathers. So even Eastern fathers. I outline this in a book edited by Joshua Brown on Eastern Christian philosophy and so forth. And Bonaventure, I think, would fall into this camp. So yeah, no, I think it's an ecumenical thesis. It's just that we can have positive epistemic status without arguments, and I think you can find that in a lot of Augustine, a lot of important thinkers of the church, and in fact, my colleague Gregory Stacey has an argument. He did his DPhil at Oxford, and part of his dissertation, he argued that, hey, Catholic faith is supposed to be certain, and it's supposed to overcome, it's supposed to be tenacious and overcome objections. And basically, if you just gave Catholic faith like a probabilistic, Bayesian inference, and that's all you had to go on, then it's not going to be certain, and it's not going to be able to necessarily be tenacious. And
Mm.
so actually you need something like reformed epistemology to make sense of
Okay.
that. And so, yeah.
And then it also, yeah, briefly just occurred to me with respect to skeptical theism and your apophatic view of God, can we say God is a mind?
Yeah, so I would actually even say that that's an analogy.
Okay.
So God, I would be fine with saying more like God's a mind star. He's
Okay.
something like a mind as we would understand it. Um, there's more reality in it than in us, but nonetheless, like I think all language about God is at best, if it's positive language, is analogical.
Okay. All right. I'll have maybe some other time we can have a full
Yeah.
discussion of that because I have a million questions to ask. But
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
okay. Now that I've set you up, I think we've got the major
Yeah.
tools in place. Okay, so we can take on the bad pope objection, which is I think going to just naturally lead into the discussion of the anti-Semitism objection. So I'll kind of I'll
Right.
I'll tee you up with the bad pope objection, and then
Yes.
we can we
Yes.
can we can sort of move from there maybe. Okay, so I know as a former Protestant, thoughtful Protestant, it's not news to you that there have been a lot of really bad popes in history. And,
Right. Right.
whenever I see people complaining about, recent popes or something, I'm like, you should read some history
Yeah.
because like what you're complaining about now is okay. So maybe I'll let you fill in some,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you're the better informed Catholic academic, but okay. So just to sort of tee you up, I mean, I know that there have been popes who, like had mistresses. There's a pope
Mm.
who dug up his predecessor and put him on trial. Right? There have been popes who bought the office. There have been murderous popes. There have been some really horrific popes. Okay, and so we might think, look, if Catholicism is true, then those people who occupy the chair of St. Peter, who are Peter's successor, are going to be particularly morally elevated people. And then I see these scoundrels, murderers, thieves, who have occupied that chair. And I think, okay, well, I mean, that's just pretty decisive evidence
Mhm.
against Catholicism, right? Okay, so why is that objection wrong? And feel free to add any more details
Yeah.
about bad popes that you would like. That's
Yeah. So I think this objection is best put by one of my great friends and former colleague, Jerry Walls. So Jerry makes a big deal out of this, and he just basically says that kind of a priori, um, you would expect that from the chair of Peter, the person who holds the keys of the kingdom, he thinks that we have good reason to think that they'd at least be decently moral people. Maybe they'd have some failures because they're human, but overall, right, popes would repent and be decent moral people. And obviously, you have lots of cases from the medieval times, which that's just not the case. So he thinks that this makes it less likely, right, that they really are holding to some sort of special office, uh, because what you expect is not what you see, right?
right.
And so, yeah. So I develop a paper, a short paper in the Haythrive Journal on kind of responding to this. And basically, I respond to it in a sense by saying, "Hey, Jerry, my guy, if you think that this is a good objection against Catholicism, then it's going to seem like I've got an even better objection against Christianity. And I'm assuming you're not, he's a Christian philosopher. So I'm
Right.
assuming you're not going to want to accept that this is going to be a great objection against Christianity. So maybe you'll want to say that this particular objection you're giving isn't really a good objection to Catholicism. And then I kind of use skeptical theism to kind of give my own sort of response and thought process on this. And so, um, yeah, basically, um, so I've got some good Jewish philosophy friends. They're dear friends of mine. And talking with them, one of the main issues that they have, not the only issue, but one of the main issues that they have, they have this worry that from a Jewish perspective, that at least some of the more obvious messianic passages in the Old Testament, think Isaiah 11, when like lion and lamb are vibing together, and the kid and the cobra are, and you got peace and the knowledge of Yahweh that's covering the earth as the waves of the sea, right? And some of these very kind of obvious messianic passages, um, the idea is that it's supposed to be like the Messiah is supposed to usher in this age. He's supposed to usher in the restoration of Israel, the protection of Israel. And what do we see the early church say about the Jews? And so you have this really kind of horrific um, study that one can do when they look at some of like the great fathers of the church who otherwise seem to be like pretty great moral individuals, um, devout and that sort of thing, say some pretty harsh and vile things about the Jewish people and put blame toward the Jewish people that ends up, and including, you know, uh, might have been the Fourth Lateran Council. I can't remember off the top of my head, but basically, like where, hey, some disciplinary canons, so not theological canons, but disciplinary canons about, Jews separating from Christians and being identified as such. And obviously, this ultimately, right, helps create an environment for someone like Hitler to come along, utilize what's kind of precedents, use kind of these historical examples, and advocate for the genocide of the Jewish people. And obviously, this is just all horrific and disgusting and disturbing. And so you might, from a Jewish perspective, think, okay, a priori, what's the likelihood that um, the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, would um, his advent would lead to unprecedented amounts of persecution of the Jewish people? And the idea is supposed to be a priori. Well, that's not likely at all, given the passages, the obvious messianic passages that we have in the Old Testament. That's just not who the Messiah is supposed to be. That's not what the Messiah is supposed to do. And so again, you have this kind of um, similar kind of structured argument where you have a certain expectation, and that expectation's not being met at all. And so, this gives us a priori reason to think Jesus isn't the Messiah. Uh, and so, yeah, I think these arguments parallel, right? One, expectations that the popes would be good moral people. Reality, they're not. Expectation, Messiah is supposed to protect Israel, restore Israel, not bring anti-Semitism to its greatest peak ever, right? Expectation not met, right? And
And
so,
I should say too
yeah,
that there have been plenty of anti-Semitic popes as well, right?
right.
So yeah.
So, then you're like, okay, so what do we do here? Do we just like accept that the Pope argument is good, but then does this lead us then to consistently need to accept that the argument against Christianity is also good? If you don't want to accept one, then maybe you get out of the other. But what's the kind of real force? What's going to allow us to reject both? And as a Christian philosopher, because I think that I've had great religious experiences about Jesus and like his love being poured out of my heart, and even feeling his presence in the Eucharist in great ways. And um, I do think that there are, evidentially speaking, good arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. People are familiar with someone like Michael Licona or N.T. Wright or William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne, to a lesser degree, because I'm less heavy on the a priori stuff, which he's into in reference to the prior probability. Um, but yeah, I think there's some good works here, some good arguments to be made. So, like, I'm a Christian. I believe Jesus rose from the dead. Even someone like Dale Allison, who's more skeptical about what sort of arguments can get us into where, I think he still gets us the sort of minimal facts that philosophers need to argue for the resurrection. So yeah, I feel like I have a high degree of warrant for Christianity. So how do I approach this? And so in the paper, I give a story of my son. My son, his name's Elijah. He's 11 now, so he's alive and well, no worries, as I tell the story. But
Okay, good.
when
Yeah.
he was about 3 years old, uh, he was, rocking back and forth on a swing outside, and my wife was like, "You're gonna fall off. You need to get off the swing, all right? Like an adult, swing where it's like on a patio, right? Not like a kid swing where you're trying
Yeah.
to jump, right?" Um, and so, he's a good boy. He listens to mommy, but he's very hyper at this time. I mean, he's still kind of hyper today. We tease him about how he can't stand still watching a movie or anything. He's got very likely ADHD, right? He's always kind of had this like crazy gotta just move sort of energy. And so he stands up on the swing and he decides he's going to jump off the swing instead. And so he jumps off the swing, but when he jumps off, there's a nail that was sticking out of the swing, and his arm gets caught on the nail. And according to my wife, he was like hanging on by the nail. And so I come home just in time when this has occurred, and he's just screaming, as you might imagine a 3-year-old screaming at this. And we rush him to the hospital. I'm holding him, like, "It's gonna be okay, buddy. It's gonna be okay." We take him into the hospital. They see him right away, but there's basically like no time. They don't want to take any time, kind of like giving him aesthetics um, um, and not aesthetics. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Like morphine or yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. They basically like just start operating on his arm right away, and there's like putting shots into him and already like putting needles all throughout. He's just looking at me, and he's like crying out like, "Daddy, Daddy!" And that's basically all he kept doing, was just looking at me and screaming at me, "Daddy!" And this can be pretty traumatizing to a dad, right, who loves their child very much. And so I was just looking at him, and I just was pinning him down because the doctors had me pin him down. I was just looking at him and saying, like, "I love you, buddy. I love you. I love you." And that's all I could communicate to him that he'd understand. Um, he couldn't figure out why I was permitting them to operate on his arm while awake without um, much um, kind of medicine to out the pain, counterbalance the pain. But nonetheless, I just kept telling him I love him, I love him, I love him. And yeah, but just because he at 3 couldn't come up with reasons why I would be pinning him down, letting these people put shots and needles in his arm, doesn't mean there's not a good reason. Obviously, there really is a good reason here, right? I mean, he could lose the loss of his arm. It could turn to an infection and go to his heart, right? He doesn't understand any of this. He doesn't really even understand death, right? But there are these good reasons. He just simply can't understand them. He doesn't have the cognitive equipment to. And so, on my view, where God again is not even a person like you and I are persons. Um, he's not a thing like you and I are things. I am more like my 3-year-old son than I am like God. And so if I'm in the position of my 3-year-old son, what makes me think that I'm actually in a position to judge if there are certain goods that are beyond my ken to recognize, or it's beyond my ken to figure out what God would or wouldn't do in some instance of great evil, especially given that I don't even think he's a moral agent. And so, yeah, it seems like I'm just like not like the hypothesis, like this ineffable God predicts that I'm going to be not in the know for a
Hmm.
lot of things that we experience and go through. And so if I think if you kind of you think you can apply this to the papal context, and you can say that, if God's not a thing, a moral agent, if he's not a person like you and I are persons, what makes me think that this kind of a priori reasoning that God would make sure that all the popes would be morally just, or decently good people, what makes me think that that actually is like likely to be true, right? A justified a priori belief, given God's kind of ineffable nature. In a similar way, we can also apply it to kind of the Jewish context and say, what makes me think that um, that uh, I'm going to be in the know with all. I'm going to be in the right position to know if God's going to allow Jewish persecution or not occur from kind of the first advent of the Messiah. And so, these things just seem beyond our ken with an ineffable God, with the God of classical theism. Seems to me like there are things that just simply aren't in kind of our uh, position that we're going to be able to know a priori what God's kind of mo is, because God's mo isn't even an mo; it's like mo star. And so, on this view, basically, I take the advice of Kendrick Lamar, and I'm humble, and I'm going to sit down, and right, I'm gonna think that there's probably lots of things that just are beyond my kin, and we can't really put a lot of expectations on what God would or wouldn't likely do. As particularly to the Old Testament, I think a lot of this stuff is indeterminate, and it's not super crystal clear as my Jewish brothers sometimes present it to be. So you have passages like in the Old Testament where the Messiah is supposed to come in on a donkey, and yet you have passages where Daniel 7, the Messiah is supposed to come on, clouds. And so you have people like Rashi who say, well, if we're really good, he'll come on clouds. If we're really bad, he'll come on a donkey, right? Or you have, in the Essene community, in the Quorum community, you have where, we basically have to have two Messiahs, Messiah ben Joseph, and Messiah ben David, right? And basically, one suffers and the other one reigns, because there are passages that seem to be talking about an anointed one where they're suffering, and another one where it reigns. And so, yeah, I mean, it seems like you have like the Old Testament's kind of, it's not super clear on exactly what the Messiah will do, what the Messiah will bring. Plausibly, you can construct it in such a way where the Messiah has two comings, as Christians think, one of suffering and then the next one of reigning. And so, yeah, it's beyond our ken to kind of figure out if the first advent of the Messiah would lead to great persecution of the Jewish people or not, given God's mo star.
So that's terrific. I want to do a couple so just to make sure I'm tracking the kind of
Yeah,
big
yeah,
picture of this. So one, I mean, we can appeal to reformed epistemology. Like if one just finds the core tenets of Christianity and in your case Catholicism in particular
yep,
just obviously true, and you encounter all this evidence about bad popes, the history of anti-Semitism, all of it, and after encountering that in good faith, you still find that you are very confident in the truth of Christianity. Reformed epistemology says that's fine. You're in a good epistemic situation. You can rationally remain a Christian despite all this sort of
yeah. If
unexpected
your
stuff
belief
that
is
you're.
still the
Yeah,
product of properly
yeah,
functioning faculties aimed at truth,
yeah.
yeah, even upon reflecting on this sort of material, then yeah, you're right.
And then now, if you don't have those sorts of
Right.
experiences, or you don't recognize yourself as having those sorts of experiences
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah,
which I realize there's like further complication there, but and if you're just approaching these matters in a more broadly evidential way, then it sounds like that's where skeptical theism can help, right? Because I can even think actually this is some evidence against Christianity, it's some evidence against Catholicism, but when I take full account of the evidence in view of my good reason to be some kind of mitigated skeptical theist, then none of it amounts to reason not to be a Christian or not to be a Catholic.
Exactly.
Okay. Um, okay. So, so forgive me for not having this in the outline, but there was something that did occur to me, and I just wanted to get your reaction to it. That weirdly, there might even be like a kind of a counterintuitive argument for Christianity from anti-Semitism. So here's what I was thinking. So
Okay.
yeah, so I was listening to an interview recently by a fellow Catholic, Ross Douthat at the New York Times, the resident
Hmm.
Catholic conservative at the New York Times,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
With a very interesting podcast called Interesting Times, and he was interviewing the Jewish political theorist slash
Mm.
activist Yoram Hazony,
Yep.
and Hazony made what I think is a good point, which is that there are countless strains of anti-Semitism, right?
Mm.
So, and it's kind of weird in that way, right? So, like, anti-Semitism is a unique sort of prejudice that is, yeah, it's like it's importantly different from anti-black prejudice as and racism as we find that in the United States. It's different from sexism, and part of it is because it's like this conspiracy theory, right? So, like,
Mm.
it's a prejudice that's got a conspiracy sort of like wrapped around it, and then also like there's this thought that we really resent these people, we hate these people, but not because they're of lower status. I mean, anti-Semites usually think that Jewish people have inordinate power, right? They're pulling the strings, they're in control of everything or something. So that's really weird. You might think that maybe Judaism. So this is maybe not a unique argument for Christianity. It might be a kind of it might increase the probability both of Judaism and Christianity
Mm.
that both of these traditions predict that there is going to be this kind of insane, irrational,
Mm.
bizarre prejudice against the chosen people. You ever had that thought, or what do you think of that line of
Yeah.
reasoning?
Yeah. So the idea is that um, that are you saying basically like there's just simply going to always be this just kind of irrational bias against the Jewish people given God's providence
Yeah,
or
yeah.
yeah.
So the prediction is that like if Judaism or Christianity is true,
Yeah,
then you should expect that there's going to be a lot of hatred directed at God's chosen people.
supernatural hatred, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That maybe can't be fully accounted for by just like ordinary prejudices or something. And then we do find that there is this very bizarre, like conspiratorial prejudice
Right.
against the chosen
That's always
people.
existed. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And we have Christian versions of it, we have Muslim versions of it,
Mm.
we have left-wing atheist like Marxist versions of it. We even have liberal versions of it. The people should go back and read the early Enlightenment philosopher, read Voltaire.
Right.
Like a flaming anti-Semite. So
Yeah.
while there's a really ugly history of this in Christianity, it is also really widespread. And you might think, well, that's bizarre. That kind of needs explanation, and maybe it's not
Yeah.
fully accounted for just by way of natural causes. So yeah,
Right.
yeah,
No, it kind of reminds me. So my good friend, he's a rabbi, but also a really great philosopher. Great rabbi, great philosopher from Haifa University. His name's Sam Levins.
yeah,
And
yeah, right, yeah,
Sam, in a recent article in the Rutledge Companion to Judaism, he actually engages the paper we're talking about, and his take's a little different. His
hmm.
take is that maybe like Freud is right, so he uses Freud to rescue the
That's
Christians,
interesting. Okay,
and basically like we're Christians and really we see ourselves as kind of spiritually in the fold with the Jewish people, with the Jewish God, and we see ourselves in the Jewish people, and we hate what ourselves basically, and it's like self hate, and this leads to anti-Semitism. So anyway, he has this whole little bit about that. That kind of reminds me a little bit of what you're saying. But yeah, I mean, I do think that probably like if you look at the history of anti-Semitism. Yeah, I think that there could be something there that's just like just always demonic and always present, and after and even kind of something like um, after all the attempts to completely annihilate the Jewish people, right? They're still around, and it's just like, wow, this seems like God has some providential force
something
behind.
like the Holocaust, right? I
That's
mean, it is the most unimaginable,
right,
horrific sort of evil that we can think of, right?
right,
And who is it directed against? It's directed against the Jewish people, right?
right.
Or like the atrocities committed on October 7th,
That's
2023, right? Again, like you might think there's something beyond mere nature at work here. It does seem like this is like a supernatural kind of evil.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So as we're winding down, I mean, maybe one sort of closing question. I obviously this is a loaded question because I think the answer is pretty clear. But yeah, I mean, like, is anti-Semit? There's a lot of anti-Semitism in
yeah.
Christianity still, right? And it's spread across the denominations. I've seen people sometimes try to play the blame game where we say, oh, like this is mostly a Protestant thing, it's mostly a Catholic thing, or it's mostly no, it's like it's all Christianity, right?
Mhm. Right, right.
So there's still plenty of it, but is it is it rational for a Christian to be to be anti-Semitic?
Yeah, no, I definitely not, and especially not Catholic. I don't think either one, but the Catholic Church has made various statements. We've thank God have got a hold of some of the evils within the church that were anti-Semitic, and we've been very clear that the Jewish people are God's people and have a role today and have much to teach us, and that ultimately Jews should not be blamed for the crucifixion of Jesus, which by the way was done by the Romans, and by the way was a part of God's providential plan all along anyway. You can't just blame a whole group beyond time and space, for the actions of a few. Um, and so a lot of the rhetoric that's been used to harm the Jewish people is in reference to, you crucified Jesus, right? No, they didn't, right? Um, but yeah, um, what I said on Twitter the other day, because you're seeing this kind of like evil anti-Semitism kind of reemerge from Christian circles as of late. So I feel like, since World War II, Christianity has been doing a really great job on the anti-Semitism issue, but then like relatively in the last few years, it's like at least with like anonymous accounts, which who knows, as we know on X, could
Right.
be from
Yeah.
like way other countries, not actually
Yeah.
kind of American or UK countries, but um,
It is
uh,
oftentimes disturbing to find that, like highly observant, like
yeah,
seemingly good Catholics,
that's right.
outwardly good Catholics, nevertheless, oftentimes do harbor really disturbing attitudes towards
Exactly.
the
And
Jews. Yeah.
so the other day I was like, yeah, I mean, literally they're like we Christians we can't be anti-Semitic. Um we can't be biased against the Jewish people. We literally worship a Jew.
Right.
And his Jewish mother, Miriam, is our queen. Right? We're in a Jewish kingdom, right? And so it just really doesn't seem like it makes sense to be anti-Semitic and Christian.
Yeah. And let's see what else. So I feel like I had some kind of follow up there. Maybe it's evading me. Um, well, yeah. So I mean, do you have any closing thoughts uh, about this or any of the other matters that we've discussed here?
Yeah, I guess I'd want to stress it on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So I've got certain friends who will say things like, yeah, maybe the best explanation is a supernatural explanation for the resurrection of Jesus, but it's maybe demonic forces that rose Jesus from the dead, or maybe God raised Jesus from the dead as a test to test the Jewish people if they would forsake the Torah. And I think ultimately, right? I mean, our priors are going to play a role in whether or not we find that plausible. But if we've kind of undercut the anti-Semitism argument against Christianity, um, and the Old Testament at worst seems just kind of um, indeterminate in reference to how the Messiah would be, how many Messiahs, what the Messiah would do, that sort of thing. That when you're looking at the resurrection of Jesus, if you're finding the evidence compelling, um, then you should really factor that into whether or not Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. What would you ultimately find more plausible, right? That he was raised by demonic forces, or that he was raised by God. Um, and so, even my Jewish brothers and sisters today, they observe the Torah differently than they observed it 2,000 years ago when we had a temple. And so, uh, Jesus telling us to observe the Torah in different ways. I mean, it's not even really fundamentally distinct with Christianity from Judaism. Judaism practices this as well. It's funny, some of the my Jewish philosophy friends that will interpret the Old Testament via allegory in some of the laws and commandments and stuff that God gives. And even the idea of kind of like a triunity. I mean, you have kind of Jewish theology that kind of makes sense of this as well. And so, if Christianity really isn't that foreign, if Christianity isn't just this Gentile religion, right? If Christianity is based off of Yeshua HaMashiach, you did Jesus the Messiah, right? And we have the anti-Semitism argument undercut, and we overall look at the passages of the Old Testament, we can say, well, we could see it this way, or we could see it interpreted this way. And really, what it seems it's going to amount to is, the evidence that we do have. And if you think the evidence is more persuasive that God raised him from the dead than Satan raised him from the dead, then it seems like that's some positive reasons for following Jesus.
My quick follow-ups came to
Yeah.
me, so to
Yeah, yeah,
run
yeah,
them
yeah.
past you real fast, and then I want to be respectful of your time. I'll let you go. But so I believing Christians should want everyone to be a Christian, should want everyone to be a Christian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some kind of tension here when it comes to evangelizing to Jewish people, and especially like religiously devout Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
do you have thoughts about that and how to sort of navigate that? As it seems one must in a careful way, give precisely given the history that we've been talking about here.
Yeah, yeah. So, I'm a Christian. And so what did Jesus say, right? John 14:6, Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Acts 4 says that there's no other name that anyone saved but the name of Jesus Christ. Um, However, I also think that God, as Vatican II says, has not been absent from other religions. That God has a presence, a secret presence, Vatican II says, in other religions. And that Christ, I think Vatican II teaches this, as well as post conciliar popes, um, that Christ is in other religions revealing truths and in other religions, which ultimately point to him. And so, I'm a big fan of the Jesuits, of the like 16th, 17th century missionary Jesuits to the Far East. And their approach, like Matteo Ricci, in fact I have him right there behind me. He went to the Confucians and he was like, no, 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 listen, the Lord of Heaven, Tien, heaven, yeah, that you're talking about, yeah, heaven, became man and died for your sins. And he saw Christianity as the fulfillment of Confucianism. Not that they needed to get rid of their Confucianism, but they can even be more fully Confucians by accepting Christ. And similar, Ippolito Desideri was in Tibet saying the same thing to the Buddhists. Right? You believe in interdependency; all things are ultimately dependent on other things. So do we. we think all things are impermanent too. Except there's that which is beyond kind of this impermanent, interdependent reality, and that's God, and He holds all things together. So if you want to believe in your metaphysics, right, you're going to need ultimately God to truly consistently believe in your metaphysics. And so it's not so much like you need to convert to a foreign religion that believes radically different things that you believe now. And I mean, obviously, with Judaism, you know, you know, we see Judaism, kind of the fullness of Judaism in Christianity. Christianity is a messianic Jewish movement. The church originally was just from the Jews. um, and so, seeing Judaism being it kind of most fulfilled in the Messiah, in Jesus. And so, to kind of fully observe the Torah in the ways we need to observe the Torah, right? It's by finding and observing the Torah from the Messiah. And so Christianity is in a sense, right, the fulfillment of Jewish expectation and Jewish sentiments. And so that's kind of the approach that I would take. And I think people can unknowingly be in a saving relationship with the Messiah. They can unknowingly be in a relationship with Jesus without realizing it. They can be trusting in Christ without, explicitly trusting in Christ, because they're trusting in the truths that Christ gave them and their tradition that point to Jesus. And if they're not accountable to believe in Jesus explicitly, because of, whatever they've heard or understood or known, then, that's one thing. But ultimately, I guess I would try to understand that the rites, ordinances, rituals, truths that are found in other religions don't need to be jettisoned or completely rejected, but just find their ultimate meaning in Jesus the Messiah.
Nostra Aetate made things better, right, at
Right.
Vatican II.
Exactly.
I think that there's a worry one can have though that, and I think this is the way that it's oftentimes presented, is like, oh yeah, like the church was sort of okay with anti-Semitism until Vatican II. And that would be very worrying if that were the narrative. So I want to just like give you a chance to sort of thwart that narrative, and then I will let you go.
Yeah, no, I mean, you have before Vatican II, popes talking about the evils of anti-Semitism. It is an up and down battle that the church fought for sure. And the church has not, faltered since Vatican II. So I think Vatican II is still important. And Nostra Aetate does symbolize a great victory and triumph over anti-Semitism. But no, I mean, you can find popes that are very concerned with anti-Semitism, before Vatican II and that sort of thing. So,
Super helpful. Tyler, thank you so much.
thank you so much for having me.
Recording, and then we can say our goodbyes really fast. Okay.